Thanks, Joanne, and welcome to everyone. And well, good afternoon. I think it's good afternoon to everybody across Europe. My name's Steve Marshall. I'm the co-chair of the EAPC Social Work Task Force with my colleague Audrey Ralston, but unfortunately Audrey's teaching today, so she can't be here. So it's just me chairing, and I'm really pleased to say, I'm really excited to say we've got three amazing speakers speaking on the subject, a subject that I don't know that much about, so I'm very keen to hear more. The subject is music therapy as a form of bereavement support. What is the evidence? So we've got three speakers, Dr. Lisa Graham Wisner, Dr. Tracy McConnell, and Dr. Noah Potvin, but I will allow each of them to actually introduce themselves to you. So first of all, I'd like to hand you over to Lisa. Thanks, Lisa.
Thank you so much, Stephen. I'll just share my screen here if everyone bears with me. Right, well, you can see that okay. Good afternoon, everyone. And firstly, to just say a big thank you to the Social Work Task Force at the EAPC for having us.
Sorry,
yes.
we can see your speaker view, so we can see your notes as well as your slides.
Let's see if I can stop this. John, would you have any advice on how to get it onto normal view?
If you stop sharing.
Yeah.
Okay, and then do exactly what you did about 5 minutes ago.
Yes.
Which is share the
actual, yeah, 1 second.
Yeah,
this should be it here.
Yeah, we're still on your speaker view.
Oh. 1 second. Apologies, everyone, for this.
Okay, we can edit the video.
I'll just see.
There you go. Perfect.
Is that it there? Okay, perfect.
That's
well,
it.
No idea what I did different, but as long as we're there.
Thanks.
Apologies, everyone, for that. But yes, as I was saying, thank you so much to the EAPC Social Work Task Force for having us here with you this afternoon. It's a real delight to be in such good company and for us to have the opportunity to speak on something we're passionate about, music therapy as a form of bereavement support. What is the evidence? So I'm Lisa Graham Wisner. I'm a lecturer at Queen's University Belfast, which is in Northern Ireland. My colleague Tracy McConnell is a Senior Research Fellow at Queen's, and our colleague Dr. Noah Potvin is an Associate Professor at Kean University, and that's over in the States. And what we're hoping to cover in this seminar is firstly a bit of an introduction to music therapy for those of you who might be new to this discipline. And then we're hoping really to make the argument as to why we think music therapy is of value as part of the overall offering really of bereavement support. We're then going to summarise where the research evidence currently lies in terms of this area, and we're going to give some ideas in terms of where we think we should be focusing on going forwards. And we're going to leave you with a clinical case study really to try to illustrate the individual benefit of music therapy as a form of bereavement support. And this is very much an emergent area, so we're really keen to get your thoughts, your ideas, and hopefully there'll be a good chance for a discussion at the end. So firstly, beginning to talk about music therapy and how this fits into bereavement. I hope it's not too presumptuous to say that music is universal. So many of us on this call will have a very personal relationship with music, perhaps particular songs, and we'll also have used music as a way to connect to others, to build community. I put up a few photos here of individuals in Italy, and this was really during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. They're out on their balconies, they're singing, they're playing instruments, and they're trying to really create a connection to others at a point in time where we were all very isolated and experiencing a mass bereavement event. I've put up a list of songs here, and these are songs that have been written by musical artists as a way to process their grief. Now, Going to have to apologise as I realise that this is very much focused on UK and US based artists. So if anyone has any examples of songs that are meaningful to them that they'd like to share in the chat, please do so. Suffice to say, music has a multifaceted impact on the brain. So it helps us with emotional regulation processes, with physiological processes, has an impact on neuroplasticity and on our cognition, and it has a different impact across individuals and across contexts. It does have a special place in terms of bereavement, not only in terms of the arts and what has been written and constructed over time for people trying to process grief, but also on an individual level. Music is something that often each of us connects to when we're trying to really derive meaning from different losses. Music therapy uses this, so it uses music within the context of a therapeutic relationship. So it uses music therapy as really a vehicle to drive change, so as a way for the music therapist to support an individual to reach their therapeutic goals. Music therapists are allied health professionals within the United Kingdom. They're HCPC registered, and they have various different professional routes if we look internationally. But that's really the distinction between music therapy and other music-based interventions, that music therapy has that therapeutic relationship and it's delivered by a professional music therapist. Music therapists practice across a whole range of different settings, and they've been practicing within end-of-life care for around the past 40 years or so. In terms of music therapy in relation to bereavement, just to say very quickly about the direction that the research body really is moving in relation to bereavement support. We know that increasingly international guidelines, policy documents, clinical guidelines advocate for a public health approach to bereavement support. So this is really around helping to support the normal grieving process. It's about early intervention, enhanced support where needed. And it's about supporting individuals across the bereavement continuum, so from pre-bereavement and right through into longer term post-bereavement. Recently, there was a core outcome set developed, and that's really what outcomes should be evaluated whenever we are evaluating bereavement support interventions. And by consensus, they agreed that ability to cope with grief and quality of life and mental well-being were the two key outcome domains. And this very much reflects that public health approach. It reflects a resilience-based approach where bereavement is not seen as something to be extinguished, but rather a space really for deriving meaning. If we look at the overall research evidence base around bereavement support generally, it is underdeveloped now. That's for various reasons, not least of which this is a complex research area, and the funding landscape, certainly within Europe, tends to be quite poor. So overall, we need more evidence and we need better quality evidence of which models of care work. So we think there's a bit of an opportunity here for arts-based approaches generally, but certainly for music therapy. Music therapy is a very holistic approach. It has an overall focus on improving many different facets of quality of life. It often has a focus on meaning creation or meaning construction. There's inherent within it a focus on developing social connection, and really in terms of supporting individuals in terms of their emotional regulation as well. So we think there's a really good fit between music therapy and a public health approach to bereavement support. As well, to note that within the research literature, bereavement support interventions rarely map onto risk and protective factors for complicated grief. And again, this is important in terms of public health approach to bereavement support, where we're hoping through early intervention, individuals won't experience any of the symptoms related to complicated grief. I've given some examples here, and these are really the risk and protective factors that are most well established within the research literature, but through your clinical practice, there might be others that really resonate with you. But interestingly, there was work that we conducted a few years ago, and it was with patients towards the end of life. It was a feasibility randomized controlled trial where we offered music therapy within a hospice inpatient setting. And we conducted a realist evaluation of that. We were really interested to see what is it within music therapy that is influencing outcomes? So what are the mechanisms of change? And we find that music therapy, it very much helped people to, resolve and develop connections with loved ones, to increase feelings of intimacy, to access positive memories from before they were diagnosed or from before their illness progressed. It helped them, for those that this was important to engage with, with their spirituality. So we were seeing these key mechanisms for change, which we think map on quite well actually to risk and protective factors for complicated grief. So the question is if music therapy can also have a similar impact for carers pre and post bereavement as it does for patients. Also to note that, so music therapy, as I've mentioned, music therapists have been involved in end-of-life care for quite a few decades now. A few years ago, we surveyed music therapists in the UK through their professional body, and we find that the vast majority of music therapists working in end-of-life care also focus their therapeutic practice on informal care. So this is already happening in practice as a result of perhaps patient and care demand, and also that clinicians see it as something that, is valued and worthwhile. So the question is then, where's the research evidence base to really underpin this clinically important area? And this is the question that we set out to answer in the Music Care project. So I've put up a QR code here that you can scan that brings you to our study website. You could Google it as well, I'm sure it'll come up quite easily. But this was a 2-year project that was funded by the Music Therapy Charity in the UK. And essentially it was around building capacity for high quality research on the role of music therapy in supporting individuals and people, informal cares of people towards the end of life. So cares from pre to post bereavement. As part of this, we conducted a systematic literature review. So we were interested in the international evidence base, the existing evidence base in this area. And I'll speak to that in a second. And we also conducted an international consensus exercise. And this was really around developing a best practice agenda to help to drive this research area forward. So the systematic review, with the systematic review, it's as it sounds, you're adopting a systematic approach to trying to identify all the research that has been published worldwide in a particular area. We were interested in studies that have been published to evidence the efficacy of music therapy pre and post bereavement. So the likes of randomized controlled trials, but also quasi-experimental studies were quite inclusive. We were also interested in research that would evidence the experience of music therapy for carers in this context as well. We were interested in studies that were evaluating music therapy specifically for bereavement, and also studies that were targeted towards carers supporting someone towards the end of life. So we were fairly inclusive in that sense. We use the end-of-life definition as stipulated really by NICE guidelines within the UK. So that's people thought to be within the last 12 years or 12 months of life. And that's really because we thought, in terms of anticipatory grief, we wanted to capture where music therapy helps to support individuals through multiple losses and not just in the last days and weeks of life. We conducted these searches, we updated it last year. It was the Joanna Briggs Institute Mixed Methods Systematic Review Approach, and we mapped the findings to the bereavement core outcome set that I mentioned earlier, and also against different predictors of complicated grief. So what did we find? Well, we identified 34 studies in this area. Now, the vast majority were qualitative or mixed methods, and there were some quasi-experimental studies and only 2 randomized controlled trials. In terms of the population, most studies were around supporting informal carers of individuals with dementia, followed by advanced cancer and then other conditions. In terms of the format of the music therapy interventions, the majority were dyadic in focus, so they were targeted to both patients and carers. Some were targeted to the carer only, And some primarily were focused on the patient, but the carer was invited in to be present during settings, and they were evaluating the outcome really of that on carers. In terms of intervention timing, by and large, the literature is focused in that pre-bereavement period, with a smaller amount of work post-bereavement. So in terms of quality of evidence, the bad news is that in terms of quantitative studies, largely these were of low to moderate quality. It is a very complex area to work within. It's that intersection of palliative end-of-life care, bereavement, and arts-based approaches, represent various different challenges when it comes to evaluation. Key issues were a lack of appropriate statistical analysis. Quite commonly, studies were underpowered, so very small sample sizes. So lack of standardized outcome measures. Commonly people used unvalidated measures. And interestingly, it was quite poor reporting of the music therapy interventions themselves. So there's a reporting guideline for music therapy interventions that we mapped the findings onto. And we found that there were various gaps. So it meant there was a lack of clarity really in terms of the actual content and what was being delivered. And for various reasons, we were unable to perform meta-analyses. Qualitative studies, on the other hand, were incredibly rich, moderate to high quality, and I'll spend a bit longer really discussing them. But just to start, in terms of the quantitative literature, most commonly interventions were targeting outcomes that related to quality of life and mental well-being outcomes. I think there was one study that focused on outcomes related to ability to cope with grief. That's another core outcome, but that's largely how they clustered. Findings were equivocal for the effectiveness of music therapy across all outcome domains, so inconsistent to the extent that really no firm conclusions can be reached. So as an example, domains relating to quality of life and mental well-being, two studies, quasi-experimental, showed an improvement pre-post music therapy. One showed a reduction, really a decrease in terms of outcome, and one showed no difference. So unfortunately, it's very difficult to reach any form of conclusions really in terms of the quantitative research at present. In contrast, we have qualitative findings now. We performed a meta-aggregation, which is where you identify findings from all your qualitative studies that you've included in your review, and you combine those into larger synthesized findings, which I present here. So firstly, there was one around social connectedness and social support. And this is really where individuals perceived that there was an added benefit to music therapy in a group context. So they saw that it enabled them to have positive opportunities for social connection and reduce loneliness. It wasn't just the group format itself, but it was also music being used as a conduit to create connection with others. So I have a nice quote here that reads, "The music allowed you to sort of interchange with other people." The group setting was perceived as creating a safe environment for people, and the presence of peers facilitated sharing of difficult emotions and feelings. Secondly, we have music as an emotional and communicative channel and spiritual bridge. Individuals perceived that music therapy allowed them to safely process and express emotions relating to grief. They also saw that it provided a connection to them in terms of spirituality. This was both for people at pre-bereavement in terms of meaning-making processes and acceptance and finding peace. And also for those post-bereavement as well, in terms of helping to continue on connections to the deceased. There's a quote, "I get uplifted by the music and I feel I can get a lot of my feelings out into the music. It's actual freedom because I hadn't sang at home for so long." We then had a finding around positive reminiscence of pre-illness identities, relationships, and finding balance. Individuals perceived that music therapy allowed them to deepen relationships and really increase intimacy. So it was discussed that it helped to bring them back to the relationship dynamic they had with their loved one prior to their diagnosis. It also helped in terms of reconnecting with positive memories as well. So the quote that reflects this is, "The music brought love back. I felt the love between us when I heard the music. Music brought us love and joy. It's so beautiful that it gets into your heart, into love, everything." And lastly, we have this finding around positive mental well-being, sense of meaning and purpose in life. Individuals very much perceived music therapy as a tool and used the skills that they learned during the music therapy interventions in their everyday life. So carers used it both for their own emotional regulation, but also to support the patient towards the end of life. And they very much valued music therapy sessions as dedicated time that they could spend with their loved ones, and protected time. So just to give an illustrative quote, "This has been wonderful for me because I always remember the sessions. We were very happy upon arriving, and even more so after we left." And just to mention very briefly that hopefully it's clear through that qualitative research that there's really a wealth of data there that evidences the wide range of different impacts that music therapy is perceived to have upon different health outcomes, and the various different mechanisms of change that result in those outcomes. We mapped the findings on to risk and protective factors of complicated grief, and they seem to align very well. So this is certainly very reassuring going forwards in terms of really trying to evidence the value of music therapy as a public health intervention in relation to bereavement support. In terms of recommendations overall, there is a need for more music therapy interventions which are specifically developed for bereavement. So quite a majority really of the interventions that were included in our review were very much focused on patient care towards the end of life, but without an explicit bereavement focus. So that's a gap, and interventions that align to outcomes as identified within that core outcome set for bereavement support. Qualitative research in this area is very rich, and it's really about just trying to translate that into evidence, with high quality trials. And this is where I hand over to Tracy, who's going to talk a bit more about how we can make that happen.
Thanks, Lisa. That's great. So this second phase of the project, we held a World Cafe event with international stakeholders. And what we mean by stakeholders, so people who have had experience of bereavement, music therapists and other healthcare professionals supporting carers. So we held that event to identify what we should be doing, so looking for additional recommendations and priority questions for future research, and how we should do the research to help build the evidence base for music therapy as a form of bereavement support. So as its name suggests, the event was conducted in a cafe-style approach with several rounds of conversations in small groups of 4 to 5 people. But instead of doing this around a table, we had online breakout rooms. So each round involved discussing what attendees raised as an important area of research. That was decided in a pre-event survey and then brought for discussion. So notes of the conversation were made by facilitators of each table, made up of the research team, and then the discussions were summarised and given to the next group who joined that table. So over time, the groups built on each other's conversations, leading to a better understanding of what the key issues are. So Lisa, could you move on? Next slide, please. So you can see here we had a mix of clinicians, academics, early career researchers with experience in this area, and that experience ranged from 5 to 15 years. And then next, we had 16 researchers and music therapists. So that was from 4 different continents across 7 countries and 8 different time zones. So as you can imagine, it was a bit of a nightmare trying to find a time for the workshop that would suit everybody from all these different countries and time zones. But we managed to do it, and it was great to have 16 experts from so many different areas across the world. So Lisa, thank you. Next one. And you can see here at a glance what the top priorities were for best practice research agenda. So don't worry about trying to absorb those all right now. I'm going to go into those in a little bit more detail, and this is recorded so you can reflect back on them. So next slide, Lisa. So you can see here that the top priority overall, unsurprisingly, was that we really need to evidence the impact and the benefit of music therapy across the bereavement continuum. And that really reinforces the key message from the systematic review of the literature that we need more high quality, and we say trials because that is still seen as the marker for excellence in terms of research. But having said that, we also need to do mixed methods research, because Noah saw in the chat there had made a really good point that a lot of the time trials will gather a lot of different folk together, and it all becomes very muddled. So the good thing about the World Cafe event was that we looked at, okay, how can we do it? And if we do a trial, how's the best way to do it that we get the best outcomes? So to do that, mixed methods, and what we mean by that is we can look at the effectiveness stuff. So we can look at the figures, but we also need to understand why, how, and in what circumstances music therapy is more likely to benefit service users. Some of the other things that our experts, mentioned that was really important is looking at a core bereavement outcome set, because again, we can only evidence benefit if we are evaluating the right outcomes that music therapy is designed to improve. We also looked at the important time points to consider for evidencing both the immediate and longer term benefits, and our experts believe those to be immediately after the music therapy intervention has completed, and then again 3 months later. And then finally, we also need to measure cost effectiveness. And this is what commissioners of services who hold the purse strings, that's what they're really interested in. So they want to know whether or not they should invest in music therapy to save health service resources in terms of improving care outcomes. Okay, Lisa, next slide, please. And theory was something that was brought up as integral in informing the various parts of clinical practice. So that's in terms of including assessment, looking at how interventions are designed for different individuals, evaluating treatment outcomes, and then just all other forms of clinical decision making that music therapists have to do as part of the treatment. So the choice of theory should be guided by individual need. So again, it's not one size fits all. It's very important there needs to be flexibility matched to the person's needs. But the person-centered theories were the most commonly chosen approach. And that's perhaps because they position treatment in the therapeutic relationship. So rather than focusing on predetermined outcomes, which can be complex and multidimensional when supporting informal carers through bereavement. And then next, thanks Lisa. And then most importantly, a vital aspect of any future research in this area is involving service users throughout. So that's the informal carers, because you cannot evidence or benefit of an intervention without knowing what the users of that service need. And then in the next slide, this shows that that's exactly what we plan to do in the next phase of this project. So we will work with individuals with lived experience of bereavement. We will work with music therapists and professional supporting carers. And that will be focused on developing a music therapy intervention that is adapted to the needs of carers of patients at the end of life, and that is practical for use within healthcare services. And they will use the learning from the phase 1 that Lisa has spoken about and this phase 2 World Cafe to submit an application for a feasibility trial. So feasibility trial is basically like running a mini experiment, if you like, to see is what we propose to do, is it possible to do in practice? And that will be looking at a music therapy intervention again to improve outcomes for informal carers of individuals at the end of life. So I'm going to hand over to Noah now, who is our music therapy expert, to share a case study with you all and give you a bit more insight into what we've been chatting about so far. Thank you, Noah.
Hi all. Yeah, so my part in today is going to share this case vignette that comes from my clinical experience working in hospice. As Lisa mentioned, I live in the States, and some of my clinical perspective is going to be somewhat rooted or colored from that origin, but I do believe that a big part of what we're going to be talking, or what I'll be talking about with this vignette, will have some transferability. With my dissertation, I looked at pre-bereavement, or caregivers who were pre-bereaved and were sharing in music therapy sessions with their loved ones prior to their loved one dying. And something that was really profound that came up was this idea around how music helps people to identify in different ways. That within a music experience, they were no longer locked in to just being a caregiver, and their loved one was no longer locked into just being a patient. And they were able to re-engage with what we came to code as a pre-illness identity, where who was I and what was our relationship before this diagnosis hit? Was I mother? Was I father? Was I spouse? Was I partner, child? Was I neighbor? And then what was our relationship? How did we define the connection between us and among us? And music therapy helped those individuals, those dyads, to recapture what it wasn't lost. It just wasn't being activated. It was still sitting underneath the surface. It just didn't be accessed. And for some of those caregivers, it was about reframing it, where a loving act had turned into an act of service, so that I wasn't having dinner with my spouse, I was feeding dinner to my spouse. And for sure, there were some pragmatics and mechanics in which they were, literally putting food onto a utensil and putting it into their loved one's mouth that led them to thinking of it as feeding them. But it was through music therapy that they're able to take a step back and recognize, right, this is why I'm doing this. This is my why in this situation, that this isn't just a random person that I am allocating these resources towards and assuming this burden for. This is somebody who I share this really profound connection with. And even though it might physically exhaust me, there is a spiritual fulfillment. There's an emotional fulfillment that can come from it. And so it was through the connection in music therapy, it was through the shared experience that they were able to rekindle that connection. And what was also really important, and that's what will be the tie-in for sharing this case vignette, was that it also helped for the dying experience and ultimately the death experience to not necessarily be one that was harmful. It allowed them to feel connected in the ways that they wanted to be connected up until that connection was inalterably changed. So with this particular case, Fred was a 55-year-old male receiving hospice care for ALS. And one of the paradoxes of music therapy and end-of-life care is that we're often referred out for work with the patient, and then we get out there and we find, what, the patient is doing well. They are resolved, they are ready, their resilience is activated. They're not necessarily what we would call happy, but they're moving through it in a way that was healthy. And it's the people around them, the caregivers, their loved ones, friends, family, who actually needed the most support. And this ultimately was the case. So I was referred out for Fred, but I get there and it's really his son, Jake, who is 15 years old, who is really having a difficult time. So Jake knew his father as this incredibly vibrant person, the soccer coach, the journalist, the guy who would take him out for trips, and just was able to infuse a lot of energy into his space. And what we know about ALS is it leads to a wasting away. The body physically deteriorates. Fred was still able to sit upright, but he weighed probably between 90 to 100 pounds by the time we started working together. He was unable to speak. He had ability, thankfully, to be able to use his right fingers enough that he was able to type out messages on an iPad that was streaming to a TV. So he was able to communicate in that way. But for Jake, it didn't feel like communication. Like this wasn't his father. This was like a physical, like a mirror, like it's like a funhouse mirror, like a distorted vision of how he knew his dad to be. And so my assessment was that Jake was able to be around his dad, but he wasn't able to be around his dad as his son. He was able to be around him as like the guy who like visits the person who happens to be living upstairs in his parents' bedroom. So he wasn't rude, he wasn't mean, but there wasn't an affection. And so my goals were to enhance the quality of family engagement, to increase expressivity related to this pre-bereavement process, and to help them to actively engage with processes of closure. So Fred was, as I mentioned, a journalist. And so he had actually started doing his own life review work at that point. He was cataloging and archiving all these pictures that had been scanned into his computer. So we started working on a slideshow. He would create categories for the pictures. We would work together to decide on what song or songs he felt were accurate reflections of that period in his life. And then he typed out paragraph-long narratives telling stories about it. So did Fred need me for this? Probably not. He was doing a pretty good job with it already. So my buy-in for coming or visiting at the house was to get Jake involved. It's like, here's something your dad is doing that you can be a part of. And Fred asked, they were from Alabama. And so, at least in the States, a very popular song about Alabama is Sweet Home Alabama by Leonard Skinner. And Fred really wanted Jake to play the guitar line for it. Like he wanted Jake to make a recording of Sweet Home Alabama to use in the slideshow. And Jake wouldn't come out right and say no, but he would hem and he would haw and he would like sort of like dance around the topic and find reasons or ways to not directly engage. And so as I'm watching this play out, I'm recognizing that this was going to lead to an intimacy, a vulnerability that Jake had been working really hard for the past year or two to divest himself from. That was too scary a place. And so he wanted to engage. So his way of he would be with us in music, but it would be through lots of humor. So like he shared the story about how his dad dressed up as Superman, and he dressed up as Superman when that's like a father-son duo. And he found this like ridiculous song called Superman's Daddy on iTunes. And it was funny and we had a laugh about it, but this was Jake's way of putting up a protective space around him. So I'm working for the next 6 weeks, I'm working with Jake and saying, hey, this is something that your dad is talking about. I'm wondering your thoughts, and we're getting there. We're getting deeper into the conversation, but Jake would always find a way to move away from it. And so we would shift focus onto something else. And then Fred moved into that imminent death phase. It's that 24 to 72 hour window where there's a number of different symptoms that we're observing that let us know that death is probably going to be coming sooner rather than later. So I give a call into the house and I'm checking in. I speak to Fred's wife, and his wife says, Jake would really like you to come out and make a visit this evening, which that's a first. That's never happened before. And I had a sense of what was coming. I walked in, I looked at Jake, I said, are we doing this? And Jake said, we're doing this. So we went down into the basement and I asked him, do you want to sing? And that was a step too far for him in that moment. Singing, perhaps more than any other type of musicking, it leads to, it elicits a vulnerability because it comes from us. We feel it on this very sensorial level, physically, physiologically, orally. It is such an intense representation of who we are. So in that moment, his ego strength wasn't such that he could come right out and use his voice in that way because he was doing so much processing. But what he was okay with doing is he knew how to do that riff. Bum, 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 bum. So if you hear Sweet Home Alabama, it's a raucous song. The guitar is celebratory. It's actually a bit of a protest song in its own way. It was written in response to Neil Young's Southern Man, which was a calling out of racism in the South. And Leonard Skinner said, well, this isn't everything that the South is. And so the song has an intensity to it. But the way that Jake played the song. It wasn't celebratory. It was heavy. It was lots of really intense downstrokes. Bum, 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 bum. And then there'd be like a grating. You can almost hear the pick grating against the strings as he would play. So I played rhythm guitar behind it and I sang, and my voice adjusted, accommodated the sonic features that he was introducing, the aesthetic features he was introducing. And so it was almost like a lament. I was singing it in a very low voice and using almost more of an airy quality, because there was, because of all the complex and complicated emotions this musical encounter was looking to capture. So we played through it, and I asked Jake, what would you like to do next? And he said, I'd like to record it. So we played through it again and we recorded it. And I checked in with him again. We listened to the recording. I checked in. I said, what would you like to do with the recording right now? And he goes, I'm not really sure. I said, well, here's the thought, is your dad is upstairs. This was something that he's wanted you to hear. I wonder what your thoughts about playing the recording for him. And he goes, he gave it a moment's pause and he thought about it. And he said, yes. So we go upstairs and there's family there. And at this point, Fred is, he's in bed, and Fred's presenting with apneic breathing, and his gaze is very fixed and clouded over. He's in that space where we're not really sure just how aware he is, because his ability to respond was compromised. But we played the song, or Jake played the song, and his dad was there and listened to it. And his mom was there, and gathered family and friends were there as well. And we did a little bit of processing about it afterwards. And then I left, and Fred passed away overnight. And then I spoke to the wife the next morning. I stopped back at the house at her request, and she said, Jake crawled into bed with his dad and held his dad's hand for about, 45 minutes to an hour, sometime soon after that session. And for me, it was like, yes, this is what we were looking for Jake to have this moment of connecting with his dad through this father-son pre-illness identity connection before he passed, so that Jake wouldn't be on the other side of that death experience, wishing that he had been able to facilitate, or not facilitate, but had been able to connect with his dad in that way. He was able to actually be able to have that. So these are the sorts of psychotherapy, depth-based work that we're looking to support music therapists to be able to understand how to approach it through an assessment and clinical decision-making process. Because historically, music therapy has struggled to explain processes beyond looking at music as a means. Like, there's an X problem, here's a Y music therapy intervention, and here's a Z solution. This is not that sort of situation. It very rarely is when it comes to pre-bereavement. And so the challenge here is to construct and design a clinical decision-making model, developing a methodology through which music therapists can be thinking about this constellation of factors, this holistic way of being in space with clients and within the music, so that these whole person outcomes can be approached.
Thank you. You're finished. Oh, sorry, I wasn't sure. Thank you very much. Thank you. And thank you to all of our speakers. That's really been food for thought for me. And I like the way that the three talks complement each other. We get the research from Tracy and Lisa, and then actually having a case study from Noah really helped to kind of bring the issue alive. So thank you so much for that, guys. I really appreciate it. We've got some questions. I'm going to start with myself, actually, because I'm the chair. I can ask the question first. I've been in palliative care for many, many years myself, and I know music therapy is quite well embedded in hospices. I now work in an acute hospital. Is there access to music therapy for bereaved relatives that are not known to hospice or palliative care? Anyone? Tracy?
I will be honest, I am not really sure. Lisa, Noah, I'm not sure if you would be better aware.
This is where my understanding of healthcare outside of the States is limited. Within the States, Medicare, our hospice happens to be only one of two types of socialized healthcare that we have, the other being for veterans. How it works with us is it's through a program called Medicare. And after somebody passes away, then a hospice is required to follow for 13 months through bereavement. And as long as the hospice employs a music therapist, then they have the music therapist at disposal.
Thanks. No, I'm just thinking, sorry, Steve, I'm just reflecting back to a survey that Lisa and I did a few years back. Can't remember exactly the date. It was maybe, Lisa might remember the date, but a few years back anyway. And we looked at music therapy provision across the UK specifically. And we found that music therapists, you know, did provide care to the family. I mean, it may not have been classified as specific bespoke bereavement support, but in essence, that is exactly what they were doing. Lisa, would that be your sense of the results of that survey as well?
Yeah, I think so. But I mean, it is what we find even like to specialist palliative care and inpatient settings and that, you know, the sort of accessibility of music therapy generally is so patchy and inconsistent and inequitable. That's, yeah, I'm really not sure if it, you know, for connecting into individuals who aren't known to specialist palliative care. I don't imagine the provisions really there.
And I think it comes back to the need for the research is to build this evidence base to show that this is a valuable contribution to bereavement support.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I suppose I come from I work in South London. We have you know, patients and families from a wide geographical area, and it's very much a postcode lottery about who can access different types of bereavement support. And I must admit, I have never heard of being able to refer someone for music therapy in their bereavement outside of those known to our local hospice.
Mm-hmm.
So, but thank you for that. I'm going to take, there's some questions in the chat. So I think the first one is actually probably more for Lisa and Tracy. Is there a music therapy course or program in Northern Ireland that you could recommend?
There isn't. We quite often get contacted about this, but there isn't. I'm a psychologist by background, so I have to declare, you know, I you know, have no involvement. But no, there's if you go on to the BAMP, so it's, do you know, I'll try to get the link and put it in the chat. They'll give you all the music therapy courses across UK. Tracy, are you aware of Irish courses?
There is a course down Limerick, perhaps, but again, it would be good to go on to, it's the British Association of Music Therapy that Lisa's referring to, and Lisa, if I put it in the chat, you'll see. But there are talks to try and get a music therapy course set up in Northern Ireland. And we're not sure as yet whether that's going to be through Queen's University or Ulster University, but those talks are happening. There is a need for it because a lot of folk end up going overseas because there is nothing here. So we are hoping that within the next few years there will be an offering within Northern Ireland.
Okay, thank you, guys. That was I should have said that was a question from Justin McKirk. We've got a question from Elizabeth Fair, who says, and this really resonates for me as well, because I know certainly in the hospital I work in, when people are dying, we will often have music playing for them, and, you know, music of their choice. So this question from Elizabeth is, what would you say are the differences between music therapy and people using music therapeutically in palliative care?
I think this is one for Noah.
Yeah, certainly.
It's a great question. And, you know, it's one in which we at least for me, I understand where there's confusion for non-music therapists, because music therapists have historically struggled to create what I feel are accessible distinctions between those two. What I'll say straight up is that no music therapist would ever feel like they own music, that it's not like our sole purveyance, that nobody else should be able to engage with it. In the same way that I wouldn't think that only chaplains are allowed to engage spiritually or religiously with patients, if that's the sort of comfort or support that they're looking for. The structure that I use for myself is Ken Agin introduced in a book about, it's been almost 20 years at this point, music as a means versus music as a medium. I think I just referenced it a second ago. So music as a means, that music is a tool, essentially. We have a problem, we're going to introduce music, we're going to get a solution. Music as a medium, in contrast to that, focuses more on the experience of music. It emphasizes the idea that to be musical is such an innate part of being human, that to be musical is a state of health unto itself. That while we engage musically, when we're engaging musically, we're engaging cognitively, emotionally, interpersonally, socially, in all the ways that we don't need those secondary benefits to validate just the innate value of being in a creative aesthetic space all into itself. And so when I think about how do I make the distinction between music therapy and using music therapeutically, I think about that in contrast to chaplains. So I think that from a chaplain will use music as a means in order to get into a spiritual medium, because that's where they exist. They look at change and transformation within this transpersonal realm, but they'll use music as a way, as an avenue for moving into that transpersonal realm with the people that they're working with. And for us, it's the opposite. We'll use spirituality as a means to get into music as a medium. We will engage spiritually and religiously to get into the site of transformation or change, which is the music experience. And I feel like that's where music therapists are distinct, is that we know how to be in space within a music environment with people and be able to adjust and accommodate the aesthetic features of that experience in ways that can accommodate emotional responses, the potential for harm, traumatic triggering, expressions of joy, whatever it might be, so that it oftentimes music therapeutically, using music therapeutically means that here's a music product that's going to be sort of immutable and finite, like there's lots of structure around it. But within music therapy, the music experience is constantly in a state of flow. And truly the paradox of music therapy is that at the end of the day, it's not even about my music, it's about the patient's music and what they're bringing forth. So I know it's a long-winded way of answering, but that's often the language and the constructs that I use to help create those distinctions for myself.
Thank you. And I think you've answered, we had a question from Andreas, which I think you've answered this. He's saying, should music therapy just be provided by music therapists, or can it be provided by anyone?
Yeah, it's a great question. And something important to think, one way of thinking about that can be helpful is that music therapy isn't, oftentimes we'll hear people say, like, I do music therapy. But music therapy isn't a singular intervention. Music therapy is a field that's filled with a whole array of interventions informed by a whole array of philosophies and methodologies and approaches and techniques. And so, yes, music therapists, their training is explicitly focused on what we call functional or clinical musicianship, so like I can give you an example of, I once worked with a patient who had a really intense response to Summertime from Porgy and Bess, starts tearing at his hospital gown, he's hitting the guitar and he's wailing, I want my mama, because this was a song about, it's lots of melancholy attached to it. And so for the non-music therapist in that moment, it's like, let's stop the music, let's get a PRN medication, because right now there's something potentially harmful happening in terms of self-injurious behaviors, and he's moving into an agitated state. But as a music therapist, I was able to adjust and accommodate the music experience so that we were able to cycle down the agitation. And then he was able to move through the experience and not be cut off from his emotion, but allowed to reshape his emotion in a way where he could feel the grief, but without it becoming too intense at that time. So and then the example I always give too is that, like, I have an 11-year-old. My 11-year-old falls down and she needs an aspirin, or not aspirin, I'll give a child like a Tylenol. I'll give her Tylenol because I can read the side of a label and say, this is how much Tylenol I give an 11-year-old. That doesn't make me a nurse. Nurses might do something similar to it, but they're bringing a whole host of knowledge about medication and side effects and application and how to assess for what's happening on the other side of administering that medication that I will never have. And it's the same way for music therapists in terms of engaging in music experiences with patients.
Yeah, I mean, that really resonates with me in terms of like the support that we provide emotionally to patients and families. Is when does that become therapeutic? Do we have to be counselors to be able to provide emotional support? And I think a lot of the support that's provided for people in palliative care is not by people who would necessarily say that was a therapeutic support. So thank you for that. I'm just conscious of time. I think we've only got about 4 minutes left. So certainly for me, I think that's really opened up some thinking for me around how I support people in their bereavement, which is something I do a lot of work, and I think music therapy is not really in the forefront of my mind. So I think I need to go away and think about that, and maybe just see what there is locally for our patients.